Of Kittens and Broken Things. Chapter 28.
She was asleep in his lap by the time they landed. They were both reverie-sated, that humming influence slowly fading from his blood, bright red hair and her scent promising more time with her than he'd ever been able to spend. He lifted her, adjusted her in one arm, and began unpacking. They'd have starved if he hadn't thought of bringing food. She brought clothes, new clothes, expensive luggage, Thane's influence. They suited her, soft green and browns and golds, rich fabrics and fit. The same colors that were used to decorate her apartment. Had Thane chosen those as well? Of course he had. He was not going to spend his time here thinking of Thane. Yeah, he was. Just one last quick thought. I'm here, you're not. I win. Thinking of Thane wasn't as painful and didn't make him as angry as it might have with her in his arms and reverie bubbling, by nature exclusive, making subjects other than her dull. Maybe he'd just think that these gifts were by proxy from Garrus as Thane had offered. It was a bullshit offer, accepting it was selfish and ignorant, but it helped him not want to kill Thane as much. He couldn't kill Thane at all. Kara wouldn't like it. Garrus could not dress her, but could undress her. He could not be seen with her in public, but he had her all to himself privately. Could not eat a meal with her out in the open, but could feed her with his fingertips if he chose. He knew he was lucky. He was also resentful of what he couldn't have, but he could not fault Krios' taste. Did that make it worse or better? Kara seemed to know nothing about what she was wearing. Better. She deserved better. Thane could not have managed anything better from what Garrus had seen. Still irritating. He didn't believe Krios so easily, disqualifying himself as a lover. Appearing to accept it placed Kara at ease, but Garrus did not buy it. Easily imagining a different path had Garrus not been there. A little less forthright about his wife's death, or a little more venom, and ta-da, no more disqualification, and Kara alone. He pressed his crest to Kara's hair, took a deep breath, and changed his internal subject to her, and not the Drell's interest in her. He carried in supplies and luggage, then the boxes of what she'd left here before her death, intending to have her reclaim them in privacy. Everything that had been here had been hers and then his, and now theirs. Her scent was nearly gone from them. He thought of maybe spreading some of the stuffed animals along the bed, but was immediately vaguely disapproving of the idea. He was oddly jealous. He wanted her to himself. The Drell banished and then previous acquaintances disqualified. He could also imagine her anxiety at having sentient witnesses with personalities and theoretically long-term memory. That would further inhibit her, and maybe him. He'd thought of Sprinklebits as being remotely approving of his actions as counselor, he had to admit. He'd even talked to her, quietly. He moved very slowly. There was fortunately no major temperature difference between the shuttle and the enclosed port, no wind, and she stayed quiescent through the several trips back and forth, only moving to put her arms around his neck and drift back down. He didn't want to put her down and have her wake up alone. He didn't want to put her down for any reason. He knew the place well. He had been here often. It had been a tradition to spend a week at Intaise a few times a year. He'd spent a few busy days installing a Turian shower, which worked with particle and air jets. Water was not a friend to Turian plate. He enjoyed the quiet and the view, time forgotten and measured only by sunset and sunrise. He'd appreciated the closeness to her, the silence and the exclusivity with her memory. He appreciated how she had gained the place and how he'd helped her do it. He'd contemplated the bizarre happenstance of being able to meet her only a few years after they would have been compelled to kill each other, earning this place by replaying a scenario where his people slaughtered hers. Everything about them meeting at all veered toward the improbable. She had been a brief gift and a lasting inspiration. He was better able to dream and imagine and grieve here, away from executor and counselor, able to be Garrus Vicarium without a title. As he'd been on the Normandy, someone recognized for personal merit and someone recognized by her. He'd imagined himself as Garrus Shepard. He had not imagined sex, just the right to her colors. The difference between Garrus Shepard and Garrus Fanning seemed simultaneously worlds away and unimportant. He had made it a place where sentimentality was welcomed. It was now rebuilt, secure, comfortable for one human and one Turian. He'd left and even improved some human amenities, adding Turian equivalents. All the windows were impervious to surveillance, and it was safe to watch the sun through them. He was nostalgic, not stupid. He never told anybody where he was going, and a one-way through a Mass Effect gate shook anybody trying to trail him. He retrieved some water from the cooler, something they could share. He sat down with her in his lap in the accustomed single huge and comfortable chair in the center of the open glass bay. He would have put 2 chairs here, but he had imagined her on his lap, like this. He watched the sun cross the sky and felt the historic symmetries click into place one by one, complicated tumblers through time resulting in an open opportunity. He wished he could reach back across time and show himself this moment, as though it would be possible here to invade his own dreams and reassure himself. He had been sure then. Perhaps it had worked. He spent a few earnest moments making the attempt. Things could have gone very differently. He could have chosen instead some path of mindless oblivion, provoked to his own suicide with readily available rage and grief. If he hadn't reinforced what she'd meant to him periodically, she could have slipped from is to had been, like her scent in the containers, until all that was left was entropy and unexplained significance, covers left on and never opened again like coffins. What if he hadn't found her message at all? If he hadn't been stubborn and obsessed enough to search for something as unlikely as she was? He could have been glad to see her alive, but nothing more. An incalculable loss. He could be bonded to a politically inclined and savvy Ava who would have bonded to him as deeply as he bonded to her, with nights in her arms and not this woman's. Lal would be a faded memory, and he'd never have heard the name Kara. He'd have someone else's paint on his face, a pattern with gravitas and legitimacy. He might have thought it was faded and perfect and right. It wouldn't be this, whatever this was, this strange circumstance, as unpredictable as the feel of her hair or her skin or the touch of her alien thoughts. It was a mystery how she managed to count herself as completely harmless while being one of the most terrifying people he'd ever met. That she thought he needed somehow to be further challenged by her ever again. She did not understand. 2 years of counting himself as virtually dead and marking time until he died, waiting until the responsibility killed him as it had killed her. Those truths would never, ever allow him to take a breath in her presence without appreciating it. She had come back hopeful and bright, seemingly the most solid thing in any room, unquestionably alive, and she wondered if she was enough for him. Every breath in your presence, Limeyeth, is a miracle. He supposed that would make him sound pathetic, but he didn't feel that way. He felt loyal. He couldn't even tell her that bond made him more loyal. Her death and his discovery of her message, her desire for more time together had meant more to him than a living Turian woman's devotion, and he couldn't explain that to her. She didn't believe him. She hadn't seen him for those 2 years. She thought perhaps it was all bond chemistry. How could he prove it was otherwise? She'd only hear it as reassurance, something he was forced to give her. Maybe someday they'd believe each other. In the meantime, with her hope and his loyalty, 500,000 Turian lives were saved. No Turian woman would have given him that. She did not understand that she was a miracle, a walking, breathing miracle, and she took miracles so much for granted. His miracles seemed smaller things, not as worthy of bringing to her attention. He would try to show her. She seemed to have an immunity to grand or poetic gestures, attributing them to kindness of the individual giving them, instead of to the strength of her inspiration. Krios gave her an apartment and a wardrobe worth a sizable fortune. Garrus gave her his heart when she wasn't there to receive it. Garrus wondered briefly how often Krios had made an advance only to be ignored, rebuffed, or blushed into effective submission by her stubborn and inherent immunity to significance. He was mean enough to smile, then empathetic enough to imagine briefly the loss of the Drell's wife. Perhaps he should believe in the strength of her immunity, and accept that it would require a different universe for Thane to have Kara claim him as hers. Perhaps he should remember that saving Kolyat's life, something they'd both done, was a debt worth more than a sizable fortune. Maybe later. He preferred dislike bordering on antagonism. It was more comfortable. Garrus didn't want to seem to value her body so little, but in a way he did. It was her spirit that had guided him for years. Since she'd been back, she had lived up to the promise of her spirit beyond his imaginings. He considered himself guardian of her spirit, but had not done her justice. He planned to correct that. He had owned her, honored her so completely while she was dead. It was impossible to share her or let her wander beyond the confines he decided were true now that she was alive again. Attraction before bond? Not as strong. Their bond made a difference, defining her as his standard of beauty. Even without that, he would have done everything he could to assure her that she was desired. He could not tell her that her species or appearance did not matter, but it hadn't, and still didn't. He'd been attracted to people for their appearance, and that had been a different path to a different place. He had been deeply in love with her spirit, and that seemed to make her body not a concern, as he was trying to find his way to her when she was still alive. When she'd come back, he'd had her kiss, but he'd also had to face the possibility that maybe he would never be able to join. She'd asked him to defer it indefinitely. He had found his place in pining. He had a lot of practice pining. It was better than being branded a deviant and rejected, as he really should have been, but he just couldn't stop being proud of himself for that moment. With her insistence on secrets, he'd considered perhaps she'd had some physical disqualification. Perhaps she had physical reasons they couldn't join. Maybe it was bond that helped him find peace with that because she wanted it. Maybe he'd already accepted a lifetime of no sex. Bond had a way of making things seem perfectly normal despite cognitive dissonance. He hadn't felt rejected. He'd only felt that whatever support she needed, he would give. It resulted in him making sure she knew she was desired while she was afraid of exactly that, for good reason. He'd accepted spiritual rather than physical bond as more than a blessing. He would still always make it absolutely clear that she knew she was desired, and he would do everything he could to make her feel wanted. It was sexual etiquette, manners. If he didn't care for dinner, he would still praise the host's efforts. If he didn't like the sex, he would still make certain that the person felt desired. No person should be damned with faint praise at a vulnerable moment. Certainly not his bondmate. She told him she trusted him to be himself, and in a backward way, this was him doing the same. Whoever you are, Kara, that will be enough. I won't let it be not enough. She was right. He'd never tell her if he were disappointed. He'd lied to her about lying to her. He didn't feel any guilt. Maybe he'd lied to her because he was certain that disappointment could not possibly overwhelm what he already felt. He hoped so. She held too many hard truths in her heart and head and hands. He would not be one of them again. He wanted her eyes to clear and her tears to stop and to be able to see her smile. All of her different smiles, from the terrifying to the tender. She had enough to bear. He would not add to her burdens. He wished to lighten them if he were given a choice. He sipped water and watched the heavy bright sun, the way it cast spark and shadow in her hair, and the way the pace of their breathing rose and fell together, not knowing if he'd matched his pace to hers or hers to him in her sleep. He'd sat here before, slowly getting drunk, sub-vocals building because nobody could hear him. Now he was here with her, and he didn't think she could ever understand the difference between who he had been then and who he was now. He did not want to introduce her to the man he had been in here alone in the dark. Perhaps telling her would make her feel he was so devoted to her memory that nothing about her as a real woman could change that. Not wise. For him, it reinforced the idea that he had courted and cultured his own fate, that he knew she could have slipped away from him if he hadn't held on so tightly. She shifted and her eyes opened. She looked up at him, and he had her smile and her clear eyes. She was so beautiful. He said softly, "We're here." Mostly when this place heard his voice, it had been swearing at a stubborn vent or drunken and maudlin, not gentle. He could offer better things now to her, to here, to them. She looked around, out the transparent bay to the sun.
It's beautiful here. Stark. Peaceful.
All those things. He gave her the water bottle. She took a few sips and handed it back. They sat in silence until her stomach growled and she sat up suddenly.
I forgot food. Garrus, I forgot food. Oh no.
He smiled and pressed his lips to the top of her head. "It's okay. I didn't forget." He had a moment of wondering if she was going to look disappointed that they couldn't go back and pick up food, gain a reprieve and a delay, but she looked grateful and collapsed back onto his chest.
Thank you. I'm an idiot.
No way he was agreeing with that. Instead he said, "You're nervous, not an idiot."
So much for strategic capacity.
"Nervous. I took care of it, so it means you relied upon your ally, who came prepared."
Thank you, ally.
"You're welcome. Hungry?"
Yeah.
He carried her into the kitchen, put her on her feet in front of the open refrigerator, and showed her the catered prepared food, things he'd noticed she liked. Food he could do for her, since he entertained humans often in meetings. Ordering it personally and asking for it to be packaged or preserved wasn't out of the ordinary. She stared.
Is that a whole lemon cheesecake from Nimitz?
"Is that what that is?"
I love you. Best ally ever.
She started to pull it out, and he asked, "Isn't that dessert?"
Technically, yes, but I'm on vacation. I'm eating this all week. 12 meals straight.
12 meals, and they would only be partially done with a week. Treasure. He grabbed an ale and some quick cold fish something. He didn't care. He watched her laboriously cut the cake into even slices, happily dishing one out. He sat at the simple table and thought, just these few moments, not her ghost, really her. She was making poor eating choices. He was facilitating that, and he was happy. He'd learned apple juice didn't go with everything, so he also brought milk and water, and he wanted to learn the combinations. Milk. Milk with cheesecake. Human food did not smell good. He didn't tell her. All he did was smile and then decided he should remember what he was eating because he should be able to recall this all clearly. Marrowlet fillet. The chairs at the table were across from each other, but she ignored that setup. She dragged her chair to sit next to him, the legs of the chairs touching, and he was again happy. Inordinately happy at that she wanted to be near him, didn't embrace an excuse to be further away. He was getting nervous. He didn't really know what to do other than feed her. He didn't want to rush her, didn't know if he should immerse her, so to speak, didn't know, and wanted her to tell him. He was happy with Merlet, cheesecake, and touching chair legs. He'd be happy with falling asleep clothed and having nowhere to be tomorrow. He was happy with time with her. He wanted to get it right for her, and that was always harder than getting it right for himself. What the hell was right for them, he had no idea. Would he be okay if they left in a week and they hadn't had sex? Yes. Yes, he would. He had her time, he had her attention, and she appreciated cheesecake and sat with him. That odd, unexpected gesture of her pulling her chair to him, and now he wanted more of that. More of her wanting to share his space without him overwhelming her. He had to prove he could bring her back under every circumstance, and he would. He'd better practice his best alpaca impression. He wondered if the person that he would be a week from now would be trying to reassure him that it would be okay. He hoped. She finished every swirl of yellow and white, scraped a plate, and then reached for his hand. She looked at the empty plate and said slowly,
So, if I'm going to learn, How to swim? Do you suggest the sudden immersion method or the set of small shocks?
He stroked his thumb over her knuckles and said quietly, "How about a series of small shocks and then one really big one?"
Was that a joke?
Maybe.
I'm not sure you're taking this seriously.
Well, I don't know how to swim. My lesson would have to end in drowning.
That's the big shock?
Maybe.
Garrus Fanning, who I am lucky, incredibly lucky to be blessed with as a bondmate. Will you please excuse my nervousness and lack of experience? I think maybe it would be better if I came to you with more of what other people have. More of an expectation of sanity. But I didn't. And I can't. And I won't. You deserve the best. I've always wanted the best for you. And I'm sorry if I didn't think I was that. I'm sorry if I implied we were stuck with each other or that you lied to me. I'm blessed. I know it. I'm sorry if I have ever made you feel as though you were a burden. I'm sorry I was too shy to let you know I found you devastatingly attractive. I'm sorry if I was too shy to think you could be interested in me. I should have done so many things differently. Would you please forgive me, and can I start over here with you? Do you know how many hours I'd spent on the Normandy, pacing my room trying to figure out how to talk to a Turian?
Saying hello works.
No, it didn't. You told me a story about Salion.
Oh, right. Maybe say hello more than once.
See? Now I know that. I was going to ask you to work on the Mako suspension and sensitivity on steering. I couldn't bring myself to do it.
What? She was perfect.
No, she wasn't. She could have... Never mind. Me, able to order anybody to do anything, and I felt bad trying to ask you to fix her.
Because she was perfect.
No, because I was scared.
Because you were wrong.
I was wrong about a lot of things. Would you please forgive me?
Not if you're talking shit about the Mako.
Fine. She pulled her hands down to the screen. You could have done this.
He grabbed her arm and pulled her Omni tool closer with an from her. He read the specs and said dismissively, "That wouldn't have worked. That would have set off the..."
She held up a finger.
He narrowed his eyes and sighed, and then looked.
It's a combination thing.
He sighed again and said, "Fuck. Yeah, that would have worked. Damn it."
So it seems not asking was a good instinct.
You don't mind if I swear, right?
No, not at all.
Why don't you swear?
That's a long discussion.
What, we don't have time?
I don't want to distract from swimming.
Mood's ruined. You had to insult the Mako?
Not the Mako, just your maintenance of her. And I couldn't do it. She was great.
You're the best Mako driver I've seen.
Thank you. I'm sorry I ruined your mood.
He hadn't let go of her arm for the exchange, and he wasn't about to. He asked, "What if sex makes you want to swear?"
That's easy. I'll say your name instead. It's been a stand-in for every single word I've wanted to say to you. It works. Your name means a lot to me.
That's it. If anybody asks, you started it. I was being a gentleman. I knew I was in trouble when you dragged your chair next to mine, but I couldn't escape.
Started what?
This. His hand slid up her arm and under and then around her back, pulled her to him, off her chair, with him standing up and her finding her place against his body. This they knew well. This she was so good at doing and wanting. Her legs clung tight around his back and her arms went wide around his cowl. He licked down her throat, tasting her racing pulse. You make me crazy.
I started out that way. Crazy, but I'm really hoping you can make me sane.
Not tonight, my Limeyeth.
Maybe by the end of the week?
You have a lot of crazy, Kara. We're going to celebrate that before we try to make any changes. For now, meet my crazy. Make friends.
I love you, Garrus.
The way she said it, his name did sound like everything. He was going to count every single one of his firsts, their firsts. He was going to make her crazy. It didn't seem possible that she'd be as crazed as he was, but he'd try. And he truly did not care if she spent every moment of them touching in a reverie haze. For now he preferred it, and if he wanted her to talk, he'd tell her what to say. I love you, my Limeyeth. Kiss me, Kara. Her cool fingers were between his jaw and mandible, her mouth on his, and he kept an eye barely cracked open to make it to the bed that was fortunately near. He sat down and leaned back, bringing her with him, her mouth and fingers along his hide. He had a Turian pillow, his fringe projected over the back of that, his knees bent. She shifted to his lap, her knees down on either side of his waist, her trusting weight on his chest. He'd learned her and her hunger here. Gratifying in the way she sought out at the hide at the side of his throat with her lips, her fingertips trailing along the harder lines that defined him. He knew that she'd moved from reverent tracing to warm exploration, and then her tongue on his, her nails would find a place on his plate where she could apply pressure, and he could feel that along the skin underneath. Best of all, she'd insist herself that his shirt came off. He usually only had to shift to help. Watching her burnished red hair, his fingers twining between the strands, her lips and fingers along his chest. She'd want scent, and she'd get it. She'd want reverie, and she'd get it. And now she gave every sign of wanting him, and she would get him too. This was not a woman sorry about her choices, her apprehension and anxiety gone. He was still going to wait for her to set the pace, and if that took hours, good.
Kara leaned up and on this seemingly new Garrus, who she'd only known for a few days, really. Someone who would work with her and not against her. Someone who would give her what she wanted and let her go do what she had to. Someone who smelled and tasted and felt so very good. She'd gotten pretty good at Turian fashion, at least shirts. Her fingers found and released the catches slowly, and he cooperatively helped her take it off him. Finding out that she wouldn't be thrown on a virtual set of Turian porn expectations, camera ready, had been very helpful. She was on that hill of warm honey, and she was going to roll her way to the bottom. She trusted him. Sitting on his lap like this, she'd have to raise her thighs to reach his mouth, and he would have to bend down to reach hers. She strained up to kiss him, and he met her, a soft, contented sigh of relief on her breath once his tongue touched hers. She had reverie and courage and love and a little fear and a little worry. She let the reverie slowly replace the fear and the worry. Courage seemed unnecessary, and love was augmented, as always, by a meandering flow of warm desire, realization that the boundaries were lifted, and she could, as he phrased it, claim him as hers. He'd already claimed her. After his bond in his office, he'd said he'd wait and let her decide. That seemed to be what he was doing, slow-paced and permissive. Reverie built to her moans and her nails finding places in his plate where they could dig in and hold.
What does it feel like when you kiss me?
Your voice makes my stomach flutter.
Is that a good thing?
That's a very good thing. When I kiss you, it feels like I'm underwater. In a new world, warm and suspended, no gravity, silence, all around. And when you talk, it blocks out any other sound I might ever want to hear.
If I do anything you don't like, tell me right away, Kara. Reverie should make everything feel good, but you have a tricky little mind.
I do.
You should stop thinking and focus on feeling.
Can I think that I love you?
Always. If it doesn't feel good, tell me. If it does, tell me, okay?
Okay. That feels good.
What part of that?
Your voice, your chest under my hands, your mouth. Garrus, please.
Anything you don't like so far?
No, just my tricky little mind.
She won't last. She'll give up, get tired, go to sleep.
You can shut off my mind. I shouldn't like it.
But you do?
Oh, yes.
I want to look at you, Limea. I want to see your skin. I want to see your skin under my hands. Keep your eyes closed if that makes you nervous.
I think I will.
All right, if you get cold, you tell me. We'll make it warmer. I'll make you warmer.
Okay.
He'd only felt the curve of her spine under and through fabric. Now he moved both hands slowly under her shirt and scratched down her back with talon tips dragged behind flat, warm palms. She tipped her head back and let out a long... He had no experience with the fastenings of her clothes, so he retrieved her hands and put them on the clasps of the soft golden-brown patterned fabric of her fitted tunic. She moved her hands as though hypnotized, her expression not changing except for slight concentration through thick bliss. She kept her eyes closed, unsure what to do once the fastenings were released, the fabric hanging open. He scraped a talon of each hand through the marking scent and drew it down along the revealed lines and curves of her skin. She breathed in, unself-conscious pleasure on her features and in her soft moan. Here he wanted to stay a while. He leaned her back against his knees, the fabric pooling around her breasts, his attention drawn to the odd hole on her stomach, navel. Her skin looked even paler than her face and arms, near translucent and unbearably delicate. Her freckles were scattered farther apart where the sun had not touched her skin. He retracted his talons and moved a finger pad around the outside of her navel. She was very ticklish, he knew. She opened one eye and smiled at him. He made a note of it. That was ticklish. He wondered what his tongue would feel like there, and he'd find out later. He moved his hands to the curve of her waist on either side, bone structure alarmingly obvious under the skin. Her ribs made a ladder his fingers could climb. Her head was tipped back on his knees as he smoothed more scent along her waist and then up, until his thumbs were under the slight swell of her breasts. These were as strange to him as he imagined his fringe was to her. His fringe was entirely impractical. He shifted his thumb along the soft skin that gave to the slightest pressure, to one of her nipples. The moan she let out made some veil of restraint in him tear down. He gritted his teeth for a moment and tried to think through the presence of that sound. He fought the urge to open his legs and let her fall back, shift his weight until she was flat on the bed, the fastest way there. And then her eyes would open in shock, and he would not be going slowly. It occurred to him that he was going to experience his own series of shocks. He breathed deliberately as she opened one eye and said,
Problem?
Opposite. That sound makes me want to head toward Big Shock right now. He moved both palms to cup her breasts, the hide low on his thumbs brushing simultaneously over both nipples, moving from soft to prouder raised skin that gave way to his hands. His hands and her breasts were obscured by skimming fabric. but he saw her face with her eyes closed and heard a more ragged moan from her throat. It was like holding a remote control to a woman. Humans had gone the opposite route from Turians in evolution, with humans as impractically soft and responsive as Turians were impractically hard and insensitive. He began to appreciate even more why she was afraid of him. Invisible collar and breasts alone, a kiss, a stroke, and she was melted moans. Every defense she cultivated so carefully, gone to the power her own skin had over her, the power she'd given him, the power he'd taken. He had to have her on her back. He wanted both hands, his mouth on her breasts, and the angle here was impossible. If he lifted her by the thighs to bring her breast closer, he wouldn't have his hands. Again, don't shock the woman by dropping her suddenly and attacking her. Here's where Turian's being impractically hard, with his resurgent need to tear, was not helping. He slid his hands along her back again, under the tunic, lifted her and shifted her against his chest again. His crest to her hair and her soft, accepting sigh, he eased the fabric off her shoulders, down and away, talons down the delicate skin of her back, and his talons left pink trails down her skin. He stopped and took a deep breath. He drew a second set of lines, just to be sure. He was sure. He closed his eyes, opened his mouth, closed it again, and then said, "You are so beautiful."
Yeah?
Yes, Limayeth.
I'm glad you think so. You are magnificent.
Yeah?
Yes, Garrus.
His arms closed around her. He carefully rolled her onto her back, aware of the pressure of her breasts against his plate, but not the texture of her skin. Her mouth came to his again, and he was happy in his timeless sense to kiss her until she was panting. Here's where your promise of 6 hours bites you in the ass. You're not going to make it that far. Despite your promises, you're prone to gratuitous violence and big explosions. Hopefully not bad dialogue. He kissed his way down her mouth to her breasts, finding the lines of scent he'd drawn and getting those deliberately onto the plate of his face. His instinct was to test every texture with his teeth, but he didn't hear. His tongue along one nipple, his hand holding her other breast, and she was arched up into his touch. She was expressive to the point of abandoned, loud, her hands at the back of his fringe, pressing in with her small fingertips in too many places to be real. His pants were not well chosen, and no pair would have been without expansive tailoring, and he had to get them off, his plate spread to painful strain against tight fabric. He stripped the blankets on one side of the bed, shifted her over onto them so she would be covered and not cold when he stood. Turian tailoring was by necessity a pain in the ass, and he was afraid if he chose to tear his own off, he'd do the same to hers. And he wanted, at all costs, to avoid association with and potential of tearing. She opened dazed eyes questioningly, and he said, "I'm not leaving you. I have to take off clothes." He expected her to maybe nod and close her eyes again, but her eyes followed him as though hypnotized, again. There was no way to play this down, so to speak. He watched her as she watched him, his hands slow. Not striptease, but steady. This would not result in tease. Even for Turians, he was big. He'd seen some human porn with comparable males, but they were advertised as gargantuan. He'd seen comparable toys. They'd simultaneously given him hope and the urge to pray to whatever spirits guarded sexual compatibility between species. It might be a testament to the porn she'd watched. She did not run or look away. She did blush, and he gave her a crooked smile. It might be a testament to choice and reverie and love and her indiscriminate curiosity. She held the blankets open for him with a smile back. Surprise, his own small shock, affection, and the need to return to her mouth had him sliding back in with her between cool to warming sheets. He held his weight off her with one arm, a hand on her breast as he tasted the moans that affected him so much. Possessive fire along his spine. Ownership of every sound, each one a first and new. She smelled more sharply and sweetly of desire, the blankets trapping the scent. Her body was arching into his, only her hips free to move without restraint. His hand left her breast, moved back down the ladder of her ribs, along the curve of her waist, and then down along the swell of her ass, lifted her up to press against him. He was down along her body with his mouth to her breast, her hips against his abdomen. He shifted so one of her legs was trapped between his, cock pressed against the upper length of her thigh. She was not shy or afraid anymore, and he had to shift up soon because the pressing of her thigh rhythmically to his was, screw 6 hours, he wasn't going to make it 20 minutes. His mouth followed the path of his hand. He licked the curve of her breast, down along the textured rise and fall of her ribs, scraped his teeth along the inner curve of her waist, his hand tugging at her pants with her catching on and lifting up to assist. Bless her helpful heart. He couldn't see her. Someday he'd get her in a warm room, or he was going to turn the heat up here a bit higher, definitely, and see her more clearly. That was also the best way to get her full body flush. He wanted that mirror again. He wanted any mirror, or some light. He brushed fingers between her thighs just to triangulate, and she lurched off the bed. His hand pulled back suddenly, but not quickly enough. He ended up with his finger veering off at a sharp vector, and she cried out. With Reverie it wouldn't be pain, not right now, but they shouldn't do that again. She'd likely have a Turian finger-shaped bruise on her inner thigh soon.
Sorry. That was my fault.
He kissed back up her body to her lips and then said, I'm going to turn up the heat later. Right now, Kara, I need to see her. I'm going to get lost. Lost is bad. That was a bad sound.
It was my fault. I was surprised.
Let's go for less surprise and more, okay?
No blankets are okay.
Think you can manage that full body blush thing?
I think I'm already doing that.
Good girl. He kissed her lavishly to offset the teasing of those words. Didn't stop until the tension was soaked out of her, until she was back to mindless moans. Spirits, he loved those so much. He shifted down her body, leaving more scent painted with careful fingertips, lines drawn with the very cautious scrape of a tooth. For Spirit's sake, he could write his name on her. He was going to, just not right now. Maybe he'd write property of Garrus Fanning in Turian script on her back while she was sleeping, to match the property of Shepard to any Turian who cared to look. Didn't matter if it disappeared in minutes. All that mattered is that he had the opportunity to write it. He'd always wanted to learn how to paint. He'd transferred that to a passion for calligraphy on her skin. He scraped his teeth along her hip, learning her sounds, the arch of her spine, and requests for more of everything. He'd asked her to tell him what felt good, and she was obliging. The echo of "good girl" in his head was juxtaposed with the image of Commander Shepard having the citadel wrapped around her finger, and it was just immature enough to be slightly embarrassing and really, really satisfying. He had to figure out how to get her literally wrapped around his finger. But human anatomy was confusing. Open, vulnerable, and prone to her lurching. He couldn't ask her to show him. If he wanted a full-body blush, he'd get one, but she'd be mortified, and maybe she didn't know. No, asking her was not how he was going to go about this. She was blushing all over, patches of color on her thighs, her eyes closed tight, and just enough reverie for her to not run screaming, but not enough for her to not be embarrassed, possibly fatally so under non-reverie circumstances. He kissed along the insides of her straining thighs, realized he was going to have to restrain her or she would lurch again. He pressed his shoulders in against her inner thighs, looped his arms under her upper thighs, holding her down, moving to explore her with tongue and not fingers, not yet. She couldn't injure herself with a lurch against his tongue. He didn't imagine her thighs could spread much wider, tense and trembling. Turian hips did not do that, or move that way. He touched his tongue to her clit. She behaved as though she had been electrocuted, but the sound she made was not pain. He had tried to at least do some specific research here, feather-light tongue strokes, hardly any pressure, until she was whimpering, sounding desperately anxious, mewling his name between the music. He stroked lower with a careful finger, finding a spot that gave slightly, but everything about her was give. She was slick, thick, wet. He shifted his tongue down until he was sure his tongue could press inside, finding that spot with his finger and moving his tongue back up to her clit. She was near bucking, begging, with his shoulders holding her open, his tongue finding a pace to match her accelerating whimpers, his finger able to twist very gently inside, tight enough to feel like she was trying to throw him off, push him out. He had a moment's existential horror that he would never be able to join. She was cutting off circulation to his finger. Then he imagined that sensation gripping his cock, and it suddenly felt like she was pulling his finger in deeper, strong, rhythmic clenching around his finger, which was able to glide in and out covered in slick wet. Suddenly, now more her scent than any he'd associated with her. Her thighs were trembling but restrained. His shoulders shoved to hold her open, focused on her every reaction from the light pass of his tongue and the slow twist of his finger. And here he owned her. He had just enough restraint to remember not to hurt her, more reminded by the texture of softness making up his new law. He'd meant to have her claim him, but holding her down in her own ignorance made that impossible. Intent overwhelmed by the scent of her and the bucking of her helpless hips. She attempted to arch again, but she could only do that with the rest of her body, thrashing with a low, ragged scream, setting off harder, tightening around his finger. A wet rush he felt surge along his finger and onto his hand. Snarling and fevered, he pulled back to watch her come, watched her writhe and strain, and heard her scream. He bit the inside of her trembling thigh, setting her off again, a burst of aftershock, high keening moans and panting. He licked at her blood, licked at the rush of wet heat, tasting helplessness and seeing that he would never have to ask her to open to him or open for him. That was done. She was done. She was his. Not just prey scent, prey self, bone deep and in her blood, in her nature set to the opposite of his. She would never meet him halfway. He had to close the distance, thrilled to do it in the galloping haze of losing his mind and gaining instincts. She would take him. She had to take him. She was his bondmate. He lurched forward, hooking the thigh he had not bitten with his elbow under her bent knee, holding her open, his other hand guiding his cock to find that slick hot spot in her that seemed to pull him inside from her still clenching shock. He bit down on his tongue, blood mingling and entry gained by pressing her open by fractions of inches, pulling back and pressing again, mindless screams of not pain from her. She was vibrating, thrashing pleasure made of delicate flesh and moans. Reverie was as unnaturally slick and hot as whatever she was made of, as fucking impossible to resist as it had been when he'd had her against that door. His. Absolutely his. Every inch of this woman, inside and out, real and imagined. Fucking his. He should have done this then. Held her by that invisible leash and driven his body into hers so she would fucking know every moment that she belonged to him. He scented fresh blood, different from what he'd drawn on her thigh. It should have made him stop, but that thought flashed and was gone. There was no way he would. That alarm against the look on her face and the heave of her body was insignificant, unimportant, drowned out by her head thrown back and her breasts moving every time they strained against each other to get closer. Her body was as giving, welcoming, resisting, and restrictive as she was, and she was built by some god as worthy of worship as she was. She was built to take him. She tore reverie from him in dizzying sheets, hard and fast doses with every inch gained and reclaimed inside her. Her hips, when he let her move on her own, lunged up as he pressed forward until he was hilted in her. The drive of his hips transmuted into a lean down into a snarl against her throat. Teeth bared, his tongue pressing in on her pulse, her foot hooked over his shoulder, with him pressing in as hard as he could while she gave. No fucking boundaries, as promised and delivered. No metal. His. While he was on the subject of gods, he was one when he was inside her. Limeyeth was fallen. He was conquered and would never leave her. he would never ever fucking let her out of his arms, and he had to. Kara had fainted, the symbolic and the real, imaginary and potential, limp while her scream still echoed in his ears and his growl built to a roar in his throat. He panted in dazed aftermath until he realized he was going to pass out too. He shouldn't crush her. He straightened her limbs, gathered her up, stayed joined, shifted to his back with her against his chest, his knees bent, his head back against the pillow when his vision began to blur. He could tell by the scent of her blood that she wasn't injured, mixed in with everything else, overwhelming. The scent fading and not strengthening as it would with an active bleed. He pulled the blankets up haphazardly around them, his limbs losing their strength. He ran his fingers through her sweat-damp hair, thanked her for her claiming, which was a courtesy and a lie and a truth, their significance sliding away as the fog closed in. He felt a fleeting half-hope that they wouldn't wake up, so he wouldn't have to contemplate letting her go. So he still had some maudlin left. At least it was about dying happy, even if it was about dying soon. Dying delirious. He had a flash of feeling, the weakest and the strongest he had ever felt in his life, and wondered if that's what she felt every moment of every day, if this was her gift, the essence of Kara. Every day, spirits willing, he would be there with her.